The morning of her brother's wedding, Constance Hartwell did something she had not permitted herself since the night their father died. She prayed. Not for happiness, which she had long since stopped expecting. Not for wealth, which was no longer hers to expect. She prayed in the gray light that fell through the borrowed bedroom window of Ashfield Park that she was wrong about Edmund Fairfax. She pressed her cold hands together on the edge of the mattress and asked, without much hope, that the man her brother was to marry into would be the man he had presented himself to be, and not the man she suspected him to be underneath. The rings were already in her hand. She had taken them from the dressing table an hour before the household stirred, 2 plain gold bands ordered from a London jeweler and delivered a fortnight past, laid side by side in the red velvet of their box. She replaced them now with 2 she had fashioned herself from a length of gilded wire she kept among her sewing things, passable at a distance, hollow at the center, wrong in the weight of them when a knowing hand closed around them. She set the box back on the dressing table and stood for a long moment looking at it. She was not a woman who doubted the decisions she had made once the making was behind her. She doubted this one. If he meant what he had said to her brother across 3 months of courtship, that it was the man he was marrying, and not the Hartwell name, or the Hartwell estate, or the comfortable income the estate produced, he would not notice the rings until after the vows were spoken, if he noticed them at all. A man who meant to love truly would not think about what he was placing on his finger until the moment had already come and gone. A man whose eye was already calculating the worth of everything he received would know the difference before the vicar had reached the final words of the rite. She had never told her brother what she intended. She had never told anyone. She did not think of herself as a woman who tested people. She had not been that woman before this year. She had been, by every account that reached her ears, the practical one, the plain one, the one who kept the household accounts and drove the hard bargains at market in November and made certain the coal was in before the first deep frost arrived, and the one who had managed, with scrupulous quiet, the dissolution of the estate's debts after their father's illness had consumed the better part of 3 years and left the accounts in a condition she had not allowed Thomas to see in full. She had been, to the season, a woman of modest means and modest expectations, and the kind of worn competence that made people comfortable relying on her and uninterested in asking what she herself required. She had accepted that verdict the way one accepts a season that arrives cold and gray and does not trouble itself to apologize for it. It was only that she loved her brother more than she loved her own peace of mind, and she had made the decision that if she was going to be wrong about him, she needed to be demonstrably wrong. Thomas Hartwell was 23 years old, and he smiled at everyone with the same guileless and unguarded warmth, and he believed, without irony, and without any of the protective distance Constance had cultivated over years, that people were generally good and that the world was inclined, on the whole, to reward sincerity. He was the sort of person whose goodness cost him nothing because it came as naturally as breathing. And because of this, he was constitutionally incapable of recognizing when another person's warmth was a performance and not a quality. He would have married Edmund in the full and open faith that Edmund's professions of feeling were real, and he would have discovered the truth over years, in the gradual erosion of small things and the slow accumulation of small disappointments, by which time it would have been very late indeed to say anything at all. Constance was not constitutionally incapable of recognizing performances. It was, perhaps, the single significant way in which she and her brother differed. She had recognized Edmund Fairfax's within a week of his arrival at Ashfield Park. The way his eyes moved across the grounds when he thought no one was looking at him, the inventory in his gaze when he walked the gallery, the specific and deliberate casualness with which he asked questions about the entail and the income and the condition of the tenant farms. The manner in which he spoke of love, always in beautiful and slightly approximate terms, as though he had studied the vocabulary without having been present at any of its occasions. The warmth that he directed at Thomas, which was real enough in its expression, but which Constance could not quite convince herself was directed at Thomas rather than at the idea of Thomas, the convenient person Thomas happened to be. She had said nothing. What could she have said? That she had a feeling? That a man's eyes had moved in a direction she did not like? That his sentences about love struck her as the sentences of a man who had rehearsed them? Thomas would have listened, and then gently and affectionately told her that she worried too much, and he would have been right that she had no evidence, and he would have been wrong about everything that mattered. So she had taken the rings, and she had fashioned the substitutes. And now it was the morning of the wedding. The village of Weston Ashfield had dressed itself for the occasion in the manner of a village that has been looking forward to something, and wishes the fact to be known. The hedgerows along the lane to the church had been cleared, and a length of pale ribbon had been tied at the gate, and the church itself stood in the thin autumn sun with its gray stone face composed and impassive, as it had stood through every ceremony the Hartwell family had brought to it across the better part of 100 years. Their mother had been baptized in it. Their grandfather had been buried in its churchyard. Constance herself had sat in the family pew every Sunday for the first 20 years of her life, and learned by slow, quiet degrees the particular weight of a place that had absorbed a great deal of time. She arrived with Thomas in the carriage an hour before the service, and she settled him with the vicar, and saw to the flowers, and confirmed with the cook about the breakfast, and spoke to Mrs. Whitmore, their housekeeper of 12 years, about the linen. And she did all of this with the efficient brevity that everyone expected of her, and no one thought to comment on. Then she went and sat in the family pew, because there was nothing else to do but wait. And waiting was the thing she had always found hardest. The congregation gathered in its pews, and the light came through the eastern window in long, pale columns. The kind of winter morning light that is almost white and makes everything it touches look slightly more than itself. Thomas stood at the altar in his new coat, with his hands clasped quietly in front of him, and his face was open with a happiness so complete and so unguarded that Constance had to look away from it for a moment, because looking at it directly was something she was not able to manage without feeling it. Beside her sat Mrs. Alton, their neighbor of 20 years, who had brought wedding cake to every celebration in the county within living memory, and who leaned to Constance during the opening processional and said in a voice calibrated to travel no further than the next pew that he was a very handsome man, and that she hoped Constance might find herself as fortunate one day. Constance said that it was very kind of her to say so. Edmund came down the aisle in a coat of deep blue that fit him with the precision of something made rather than purchased, his dark hair combed back, his bearing composed in the way of a man who is aware that every set of eyes in the room is on him and has arranged himself accordingly. He was handsome, it was true. Constance had never disputed that. He was handsome and articulate, and quick with the right sentiment at the right moment, the sort of man who made people feel attended to, without ever quite attending to them, who offered enough warmth to satisfy and not enough specificity to reveal. He took his place beside Thomas. The vicar began. She watched his face through the whole of the service. She watched it with the particular focused attention she had brought to every serious matter of her adult life, and she noticed the way it was composed and the way it moved, and the moments, rare but present, when the composition slipped enough for something underneath to show. When the vicar reached the exchange of rings and lifted the red velvet box, she watched Edmund's hands as they lifted the ring that was to go on Thomas's finger, and she watched the moment, a fraction of a second, no longer, over before any other person in the room would have thought to be looking, in which his fingers closed around the metal and registered its weight. He knew. She saw it pass across his face, a flicker, instantaneous and immediately controlled, the calculation of a man who had expected something of a certain substance and received something lighter. It was there, and then it was gone. He did not say anything. He placed the ring on Thomas's finger. He repeated the words the vicar gave him. He looked at Thomas while he said them, and Thomas looked back at him with his whole face, the kind of looking that is itself a form of surrender. And Constance sat in the family pew of the church where her grandfather was buried, and felt the cold settle into her chest, where she had, until that moment, permitted herself a remnant of doubt. She had not been wrong about him. The breakfast at Ashfield Park was arranged in the long dining room, with the doors thrown open to the garden, and the morning had turned bright enough by noon that the light came in at a pleasant angle and made everything in the room look warm. Constance moved through it as she moved through every event she had organized, efficiently, attending to the things that needed attending to, keeping the surface pleasant and the machinery invisible. She accepted 3 compliments on the flowers. She spoke to the solicitor who had handled their father's estate, and who had come at Thomas's invitation, a comfortable man with a comfortable face who asked how she was managing and seemed surprised that the answer was fine. Actually, quite well, thank you. She found him in her peripheral vision several times, and each time she kept her own face in order. When Edmund found her near the window at 2:30, he came to stand beside her with the deliberateness of a man who had decided on a course and intended to follow it. And his voice when he spoke was quiet and very controlled. He said that he thought they should speak privately before the afternoon was out. She said, without looking at him, "Yes, of course. Whatever you prefer." And she turned back to the nearest guest before he could read anything in her expression. The library was cool and quiet at 3:30, which was when she went there. She had built the fire herself an hour earlier because she had expected to need the room. She stood near the fireplace with her hands clasped in front of her, in the same position she had taken in the borrowed bedroom that morning, and she heard the door open and close behind her. Edmund stood for a moment just inside the room. He looked at her across the distance of 12 feet, and the expression on his face was the one she had seen for a fraction of a second, at the altar. The one that came before the composition was fully in place. Then he crossed the room and stopped near the mantelpiece, at a correct and formal distance, and he said without any preamble at all that she had switched the rings. "I did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The bands in that box were not the ones I ordered from Talbot's in January. They were not." He looked at her. She looked back at him. He was still in his wedding coat, and his hands were at his sides, and his face was doing the thing she had spent 3 months failing to read, going through something genuine, while simultaneously trying to determine whether to allow her to see it. "Why?" he said. She told him why. She told him in the plain, practical way she told everything, without decoration and without apology, and without the softening that she might have chosen if she had thought it would have served any purpose. She told him that she loved her brother and that Thomas was constitutionally unable to protect himself from people who found his warmth convenient, and that she had watched him for 3 months without being able to persuade herself that his attentions to Thomas were free of calculation, and that she had needed to know whether the calculation ran all the way down to the foundation or whether there was something else beneath it. "I needed to know," she said, "whether you would stop when you felt the difference." He absorbed this without expression. "Whether I would stop," he repeated. whether the wrongness of the wait would be enough to make you reconsider. Whether you would say something before the vicar had finished, or after. Whether the value of the ring you received was the value of the commitment you intended to make. He was very quiet. You felt it, she said. Yes. At the altar. Yes. She had expected argument. She had expected him to produce a credible alternative account of the flicker she had seen, or to question whether she had in fact seen anything, or to offer some version of the morning that allowed for an innocent explanation. He confirmed it without hesitation, which was not what she had prepared for. And the not being prepared for it made the room feel different than it had a moment ago. He turned away from her. He put one hand on the mantelpiece and stood looking at the fire. And she waited, because she had found over years of difficult conversations that silence, when offered, sometimes produced honesty where speech had not managed it. My first instinct, he said at last, to the fire rather than to her, was that it was a mistake, that something had been confused in the orders. I thought it briefly, and I put it aside. You put it aside. I looked at your brother. He said it the way one says a thing that one has not said aloud before, that has lived inside as a private knowledge rather than a spoken fact. I looked at Thomas, and the thought of stopping was something I had not expected. I did not want to stop. That was the discovery I had not expected. He turned from the fire. I had told myself all the way through that the estate was the principal reason I had come to Weston Ashfield, because wanting to be near a person's goodness for its own sake seemed to me insufficient as a reason for anything. It seemed sentimental, impractical. He looked at her directly, and his face had the flat, unmanaged quality she had heard before, only in his voice. I am better at practical than sentimental. I had noticed, she said. I grew up without much. He said it without self-pity, which was the thing that kept her listening. My father lost what there was of the family income in a single season of poor investments and spent the rest of his life explaining to people why it was not his fault, which meant that it remained lost. I learned very young that wanting things for their own sake was a luxury that other people could afford and I could not. I learned to want things for what they could be made to produce. She said nothing. I told myself the estate was why I came, he said again, because it was a reason I recognized. I had not known what to do with the other reason. It did not fit any category of reason I had previously credited. And the ring. He looked at her. When you felt it, she said, and you thought about stopping. Before you looked at Thomas. In that fraction of a second. He was quiet for a moment. I thought, this is less than I expected. And then I thought, he is exactly what I expected. Those two thoughts sat side by side, and I found that they were not of equal weight. He looked tired now, in a way she had not seen from him in 3 months of composed and careful performance. The ring was less than I expected, and Thomas was precisely what he had presented himself to be, which I had not actually believed was possible until the moment I understood it was true. And then the vicar continued, and I continued, and I did not stop. She stood very still. The fire shifted, and a log fell, and the room was quiet for a long moment, while she weighed what he had said against what she knew of the man who was saying it. You are telling me this, she said at last, without knowing what I intend to do with it. He looked at her. Yes. A man who was managing me would have denied noticing the ring at all. Something in his expression moved, and she thought it was the first thing she had seen from him that was entirely unmanaged, a genuine response arriving before he could decide what shape to give it. I did not think of that, he said. I know, she said. That is why I believe you. There was a long silence. Outside the library window, the afternoon had thinned to the particular pale gold of an autumn day at its end, and somewhere in the house she could hear the last of the guests making their way toward their carriages, and the distant ordinary sound of a celebration concluding. "What I did was wrong," she said carefully. "Switching the rings was my own calculation about your worth, and whether I had the right to make it is a question I am still working out. It was not honest of me." He said nothing for a moment. "It was a great deal more effective than honest," he said. "Yes, that is the difficulty with it." She looked at him. "I am going to ask something of you that I do not have the authority to require." He waited. "Tell Thomas the truth," she said. "Not today. Today is today, and it belongs to him, and the fact of it ought not to be disturbed. Before the winter is out, though. Tell him the whole of it. What you thought when you came to Weston Ashfield, what you thought when you felt the ring, and what you thought when you looked at his face and did not stop." Edmund stood very still near the fireplace. "He will be hurt," he said. "He will be devastated," she said. "And then, if you have told him honestly, all of it, including the part where you looked at him and found that the estate was not enough to leave him, he will probably forgive you. Because Thomas forgives people. It is one of the qualities about him I cannot decide whether to find admirable or to grieve." She thought she saw something at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The early possibility of one. "You are not what I expected," he said. "No," she said. "Most people find that out eventually." She left him there and returned to the drawing room and spoke to the last of the guests and accepted a final compliment from Mrs. Alton about the flowers, and she did not allow herself to think, for the rest of the afternoon, about anything except the immediate task in front of her, which was the only reliable way she had ever found to manage anything. The guests thinned, and then were gone. Thomas fell asleep in his chair in the drawing room by 9 o'clock in the evening, which was consistent with Thomas's general practice of falling asleep in chairs when satisfied, rather than retiring to bed like a reasonable person, and Constance sat across from him in the quiet room and watched the fire burn down and allowed herself, for the first time since morning, to feel the full weight of the day. She had switched the rings, and she had been proved right, and she had felt no satisfaction in it. Being right about him did not give her her brother's happiness. It gave her information, and information was only useful insofar as it could be used. And what she could use it for was not yet clear to her. She had asked Edmund to tell Thomas the truth, and he had listened and had not refused. And that was either the beginning of something, or it was another performance. And she did not know which. And the not knowing sat in her chest like a new bruise that had not yet decided how far it intended to spread. She reached across and touched the small miniature of their father that had sat on the end table since she was a girl, a painted oval in a tarnished gilt frame, his face younger than she had any memory of him, his expression carrying the faint, surprised quality of a man who has just been told something he did not expect. She straightened it out of habit. Then she slipped her mother's ring from her right hand and turned it in the firelight. It had been on her hand for 4 years, and she had worn it there because there had been no one to give it back to, and it had seemed wrong to put it away. If you are sitting with someone you love, and you are not entirely certain they are safe, and you have done everything you know how to do, and it has not been enough to be certain, stay close for a little longer. Some of us know that vigil very well. Winter came to Weston Ashfield in the first week of December, which was early by the measure of recent years. The frost came down in the night and laid itself over the kitchen garden and the gravel paths and the stone ledges of the windows, and by morning the whole estate had that peculiar hush of cold weather mornings when the usual sounds are muffled and the light is colorless and everything seems to be waiting for something. She was in the kitchen garden at 6 o'clock. which was where she went when she needed to think, taking inventory of what had survived the first frost and what had not, when she heard the kitchen door open behind her. She did not turn. She heard the step on the flagstones, which was not Thomas's step, and she felt the cold air shift as someone came to stand a few feet away. Edmund said, "He is still asleep." She bent to examine the state of the rosemary, which had survived tolerably well. "He usually is at this hour. I sat with it for 3 weeks," Edmund said. He was looking at the garden, or at the wall beyond it, or at something she could not see from where she stood, deciding whether to tell him, determining whether the difficulty of it was a reason not to do it or a reason that it needed to be done. She straightened and turned toward him. In the gray morning light, he looked different from the composed social creature she had spent 3 months cataloging. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent several weeks not sleeping especially well. "Which did you determine?" she said. "That it needed to be done." He put his hands in the pockets of his coat. "I told him last night, after dinner. We were in the library." She was quiet. "He asked me to start from the beginning," Edmund said, "which is the thing Thomas does. He does not ask for the important parts. He asks for all of it, from the beginning, which means that by the time you reach the important parts, you have already said everything that came before them, and there is no way to manage how any of it sounds. You can only say what happened." She did not speak. "I told him about my father," he said. "About the losses, and about growing up in the aftermath of them, and about what I had learned to want and not want, and why. I told him what I thought when I first heard of him from the mutual acquaintance, that the specific quality of the description, a man who was simply kind, had produced a response in me I had not known what to do with. I told him that I came to Weston Ashfield with the estate as the principal reason I gave myself, because it was a practical reason, and I was a practical man. I told him what I felt at the altar when I took the ring." She looked at him. "I told him that I looked at his face and did not stop," he said, "and what that had meant to me, what it had meant to discover, at the altar of a church in front of 60 people, that I did not want to leave, not the estate, not the income, him." A long silence held between them. In the kitchen garden, the frost was beginning to go off the nearer beds in small, quiet drops of melt, and somewhere above the wall, a bird had started up. "How did he take it?" she said. He was quiet for a long time. Longer than I had expected. Edmund turned from the garden wall and looked at her. And then he said, "You looked at my face and you stayed." That was the thing he said. As though it were the thing that mattered. "It was the thing that mattered to Thomas," she said. "The rest is the rest." "He is angry," Edmund said. "Or something that is Thomas's version of anger, which is very quiet and quite formal, and involves a great deal of being in the same room and not speaking. He told me last night that he needed several days to think. He told me this morning at breakfast that he still needed several days." "That is Thomas," she said. "He will think it through to the bottom of it." "I know." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "I did not come out here to ask you what will happen. I came because I wanted to say something to you that I did not say in the library in October." She waited. "I was angry with you," he said. "For the rings. For several weeks I was quite genuinely angry, which I had not allowed myself to feel at the time because I was too occupied being surprised by you. The anger was there, and it is probably fair to say so." "That is fair," she said. "And then, I was grateful," he said, "which I had not anticipated. I had not anticipated that having someone do a thing I would have considered unforgivably calculating would produce gratitude. The truth is, I have spent 3 weeks telling the truth to my husband. And I believe that I would not have done it, at least not so soon, if you had not shown me in October that I was capable of it. He looked at her steadily. You told me that a man who wanted to manage you would have denied noticing the ring. I had not thought of it. That is the thing I cannot stop returning to. I had not thought of it, and I should have. And the fact that I had not thought of it was the evidence you needed. You were cleverer than I was. She looked at him across the frost-whitened garden. She had thought, in October, that she knew what she was dealing with. She had revised that assessment 3 weeks later in the library. She was revising it again now. It seems to me, she said carefully, that you have spent your life learning to want things for practical reasons, and that at the altar of Weston Ashfield Church, you found out that you wanted something for an impractical one. That is not a character defect. That is an education. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was entirely still in a way she had not seen before. The way a face is still when the person inside it is attending to something they have not heard before, and are determining what it means. Your brother is fortunate, he said, in his sister. My brother is fortunate in himself, she said. He has always been the easy one to love. She turned back towards the kitchen door, because there was nothing further that needed to be said. And she could feel that they were near the edge of a conversation that ought to close while it was still in order. Miss Hartwell, Edmund said. She stopped. If Thomas forgives me, he said, and I do not yet know whether he will, I intend to deserve it. I want you to know that. Not because you require the assurance, but because you were the only person who looked at me clearly enough to know what to test, and it seems right to say it to you. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment without turning. Do not make me regret the rings, she said. I will try, he said. Very hard not to. She went inside. It was Thomas who found her in the library at noon, while Edmund was walking the grounds. He came in with his coat still on, and sat down across from her at the writing table, and was quiet for a long moment, in the manner of a man who has thought something through to its full depth, and is now deciding where to begin. She put down her pen and waited. He told me everything, Thomas said. I know. You knew about the rings. I knew about the rings, she agreed. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He was not angry, or at least not at her, but he was something she did not have a precise name for. Complicated, and careful, and not yet resolved. And careful, and not yet resolved. You did not tell me, he said. No. Why not? She considered the question as she considered every serious question, without hurry and without deflection. Because what I had was suspicion, and suspicion was not what you needed. What you needed was certainty one way or the other, and the only way to produce certainty was to conduct the test without your knowledge. Thomas was quiet. If I had told you, she said, you would have tried to manage it. You would have spoken to Edmund, or tried to reassure me, or found some other way to make the problem smaller, so that no one had to sit with it. And the problem needed to be sat with. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he looked at my face and stayed. He did, she said. That is the thing I cannot stop returning to, Thomas said. See, he looked out the window at the frost-white garden. There is the part that was calculation, and there is the part that was not, and I am trying to decide whether the second part is sufficient, whether it matters enough. I cannot tell you that, she said. I know. He looked at her. I am asking whether you think it is real. the second part. You spent 3 months looking at him, and I know how you look at things. She thought about the library in October, and Edmund's face when she had said that a man who intended to manage her would have denied noticing the ring, and the quality of surprise that had arrived before he could decide whether to show it. I think, she said carefully, that a man who learns to love something impractically after a life of loving things practically is loving it more honestly than most people manage. The conversion costs more. Thomas was quiet for a very long time. The fire was the only sound in the room. I need several more days, he said at last. Take whatever you need, she said. He did. He took 5 days, which he spent in a state of formal quiet that Constance watched from a respectful distance. And on the 6th day, he came to the breakfast table and sat down across from Edmund and said, without preamble, that he had thought it through, and that the part that was calculation was the part he intended to regard as the beginning of the story, and not as the whole of it, and that if Edmund intended to let it be the beginning, and not the whole of it, then Thomas intended to let him. Edmund said that he intended that very much. Thomas said good. And then he passed the bread. It was December. The frost had settled into something more permanent, and the kitchen garden was quiet under its winter cover, and the mornings were the dark, close mornings of the short days. Constance found, in the weeks that followed, that the household had acquired a quality it had not possessed before, which was the quality of a thing that has been tested and held. It was not perfect. Nothing of consequence ever was. It was present, and it was honest. And those were, she had decided over the years, the only 2 things that reliably mattered. She was in the library on a Thursday evening in the last week of the month, writing a letter to their father's old solicitor about a small matter of the estate, when Thomas came in and set a glass of wine on the corner of her writing table without being asked, in the manner of a person who knows that the person they are delivering it to will not have thought to get one for herself. Edmund says, Thomas said, settling into the chair across from her, that you are the cleverest person he has ever met. She looked up from the letter. He said it to me privately, Thomas said, with the mild amusement that was his specific register when something pleased him quietly. He said you showed him that he was capable of telling the truth before he had known it himself, and that this was a gift, and that he intended to be worthy of it. She looked at her brother's face, which was the face of a person who was still complicated and still in the middle of something, but who was, underneath the complication, content in the essential way. He is trying, she said. He is, Thomas said. He is trying very hard, and he is not especially good at it yet, but he is trying in an earnest way that I find I cannot disapprove of. She looked down at the letter. Constance, Thomas said. Thank you. For the rings. She did not look up. I know it was not an easy thing to do, he said. I know you were not certain it was the right thing to do. I know it was the kind of thing that only someone who loved me very much, and was also considerably cleverer than me, would think to do. A small pause. And I know you have been carrying the uncertainty of it since October, alone, which is the thing you always do, and which I always fail to adequately acknowledge. She looked up at that. He was looking at her with the uncomplicated open warmth that had always been the thing about him, the quality she had spent her whole life trying, with imperfect success, to guard. She reached across and picked up the wine glass he had set on her table, and looked at it for a moment. Go away, she said. I have a letter to finish. He smiled at her. He got up and went. She sat for a long time without writing anything. Outside the library window, the first snow of the season had begun. Very quietly. Without any announcement, small flakes visible only against the dark of the wall beyond the glass, falling in the patient, unhurried way of snow that intends to stay. She watched it for a while. Then she slipped their mother's ring from her right hand and set it on the writing table beside the miniature of their father, which she had brought from the drawing room that afternoon because she had wanted it near her, and she looked at the two objects side by side in the candlelight for a long moment. She picked up her pen. If this story found you at the end of a long day, and you stayed with it until the snow, leave a quiet word before you go. It means more than you might think. She was still at the writing table an hour later when the house had gone quiet around her, and the snow outside the window had thickened to the kind of steady fall that would cover everything by morning, and the candle had burned itself down to a shorter length, and the fire in the grate had settled into the steady, reliable warmth of a fire that has been well tended and intends to continue. The letter was finished, and folded and sealed. Her mother's ring was back on her hand where it belonged. The miniature of her father looked out from its tarnished frame with the same mild, surprised expression it had always worn. She was not happy in the way she had been told happiness was supposed to feel. She was something quieter and more durable than that, the kind of satisfaction that does not announce itself but is present when you look for it, the way a good foundation does not call attention to itself until you think about what is resting on it. She had switched the rings, and she had been right, and she had been wrong in the way she had been right, which was more complicated than she had planned for. She had asked a man to tell the truth, and he had told it, and her brother was complicated and careful, and still in the middle of something, and that was where the story was, in the middle, in the trying, in the particular hard-won dailiness of two people who were learning the truth of each other rather than the image. That, she thought, was the only kind of love that held. She put out the candle and went to bed.